I'm a Black woman from the Deep South. I am steeped in the legacy of voter suppression, but I'm also a part of a rising majority that has the ability to break those systems of oppression and say that we can all come in.
My name is Nikolai, and I'm a video producer here at Mashable. I wanted to do a video series that looks at how we can create a more sustainable and more equitable future.
You can't let politicians pick their voters. Voters have to be able to actually choose their leaders. And you have to have systems, infrastructure that are not run by people who are deliberately indifferent to the voters and instead see it as their responsibility to ensure that voters' voices can be heard. And that's the work that I try to do every day.
I wanted to start by defining some of the terms of the discussion, because this is a show that's called The Future We Want. But when we talk about the future we want in political terms, it can kind of become illusionary very quickly. So I just wanted to start this by asking you, what makes a democracy and how do democratic forms of government actually work well?
I think about democracy as the opportunity to have direct engagement in the values and the policies that govern and guide communities. The form of democracy we have here in the United States is representative democracy, which means that instead of directly deciding every issue, we elect people to speak for us at every level of government. But democracy is when we allow people to participate in the choices and in the solutions.
So when I went to university here in London, my major was democratic transitions, particularly in Eastern Europe. And back then in the political science books, the US was seen as a benchmark of success. It was sort of the post-socialist role model for what freedom and representation means and the right to vote, etc. And I wanted to ask you, does the current state of affairs in America resemble anything from that romantic image?
I think we maintain our foundational capacity to be a model of democracy, but we have strayed too close to the authoritarian edges that we have seen take over nation states like Poland, like Hungary, what we are watching happen with Narendra Modi in India, what we've seen happen with Duterte in the Philippines. Unfortunately, there has been a diminution of democratic values in the United States because our current leader has adopted a number of those populist authoritarian behaviors, doing his best to stack the deck and to appropriate power to himself that should not be. I think the underlying challenge that we are also seeing play out as you see this battle between authoritarianism and democracy is the competence of the government.
This is one of the shorter lines. Voters in the heart of Atlanta waited for more than 4 and 5 hours before they could vote today. Hours away in Columbus, the line started before the sun came up.
When the government is seen as incompetent, the work it takes to participate sometimes doesn't seem worth it, because why would I take time out of my day, out of my job, out of my life to demand something that I know will never be realized because of the sheer incompetence of the leadership? And that's the challenge, unfortunately, that COVID-19 is revealing for the United States and a number of other democracies that are flailing. And we're creating, I think, unfortunately, an opening for authoritarian regimes who can mask their authoritarianism through what seems to be competence and the effectiveness of their ability to battle back COVID-19.
It's interesting to me the way that you phrase it, because in a previous interview that I read, you were talking about the tyranny of the minority. And it seems to be a very potent kind of way of explaining what's going on in many places in America. And what you're saying actually is that you don't run for office to win. You run for office because you want to change things and because you believe in the system, and you believe that if you run a fair campaign, you have an equal chance of winning, right? Whereas a lot of politicians run because they know they can rig the system and win like in opposition. So I wanted to ask you, according to your sort of pragmatic philosophy, if I can call it that, what happens when more people vote?
I think it's disingenuous not to recognize that we are at a demographic inflection point. And that's one of the reasons voting is so powerful and so potent. We have reached the place where the communities that have long been the victims of oppression are now reaching a majority status. And the tyranny of the minority has been that rather than accede to the changing demography and thus the changing needs of society, there's been this attempt to create this false arrested development that says we're going to remain who we were because we don't like what we might become. And we're going to rig the system to ensure that the new entrants into our democracy, that their voices are muted. And that's just wrong. I'm a voting rights activist and advocate, not because the right to vote itself is this panacea. It is the power to make those changes. It's the power to address those policy dynamics that we need to see change. It's how we deal with systemic racism, systemic inequities. It's how we attack the existential crisis of climate change. It is how we fix the broken pieces of our society. And if that right to vote, if that point of entry is denied, then we do not get the things we need. And what I want more and more people to understand is that our power to have influence has grown as the populations that faced the suppression have grown. I'm a Black woman from the Deep South. I am steeped in the legacy of voter suppression, but I'm also a part of a rising majority that has the ability to break those systems of oppression and say that we can all come in. That does not guarantee that we'll get what we want. And in fact, I think as the majority grows, we're going to see fracturing about what that is, what we want looks like. And that's okay. That's what democracy is for. But we have to have the conversation, and it has to be a legitimate process. And those who are losing out because their voices are being melded with others have to simply adapt to the fact that in a democracy, you're not always going to get what you want.
And speaking of which, when it comes specifically to elections, they're often framed as a referendum about the future. And that's particularly true of 2020. But especially after, the election of Donald Trump, many elections, at least in my point of view, in America have been more about the influence of the past on the present than where the present can go in terms of the future. So I wanted to ask you a final question, which is, I think now that we've laid out what a democracy is and what are some of the main challenges, particularly to America, if your sort of political playbook is correct, which it definitely seems to be in Georgia and then in 2018 in the midterms, if the playbook of engaging with voters in a serious manner, of taking them seriously, of agitating, of registering them, of increasing the vote turns out to be correct, and you get the political power that comes with that representation, what is your vision for America in the coming years? What is possible to achieve with that political power?
When I ran for governor, I had a triumvirate of policy platforms. Education that educates the whole child and is from cradle to career. That's critical because the foundational pathway for success in America is access to education. We know of people who did not have it who succeeded anyway, but they are outliers. They are not the norm. And we have to make the norm the reality for everyone. So it's education. It's about the economy. It is making certain that there is economic justice and that poverty, which for me has been the galvanizing force for most of my sentient life, it's making certain that the poverty that comes with economic injustice, that is disrupted. You cannot guarantee economic success, but you can guarantee economic opportunity. And that is the conversations about livable wages, about labor, about making sure that you are treated fairly in the workplace, that you get paid a fair wage. And so there's a whole encompassing space that looks at the economy. And the third is justice. And into that bailiwick, I put criminal justice, I put environmental justice. One of the challenges of climate change and climate inaction is not simply that it is an existential threat, it is an injustice to those who deserve to be able to live full and rich lives. It's about access to healthcare. There is an injustice when healthcare is denied, not because it's not available, but because you won't allow a person to access it. And so into that universe, I put all those pieces. But my fundamental belief is that opportunity is what we should be driving towards. And the expansion of access to that opportunity is what progress looks like. We have spent the last 20 years, the last 40 years, the last 240 years trying to mitigate the original sins of American orthodoxy. But we have been good at doing better.
This law is not an effort to punish or coerce anyone. It is to give all our people the right to choose their leaders. To deny this right, I think, is to deny democracy itself.
what is so dynamic about the United States, why I'm proud to be an American, is that we have the ability to meet our failures and try to do better the next time. And that should be the ultimate driver of our policies. But as long as we are stuck in this pitched battle about the past, you're absolutely right that there seems to be no space for discussing the future. And that's why the 2020 election is so critical, because we're not simply relitigating 2016. We're also redoing the 2010 election. And the reason the 2010 election was so critical was that it wasn't just an election about a midterm. It was an election about the next decade of power, economic and political. And so if we think about this, it's about making certain we have leadership at the top that sees and believes and invests in everyone. But it's also about making certain that we are working at the fundamentals, ensuring that every level of government, opportunity and progress are real. And again, not that we can guarantee its access, but we can guarantee the opportunity for it to be so.